Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Monday, June the 5th. Today we're going to be chatting with our good friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. Obviously, two big stories over the last several days. The terror in the UK. This is the second time, I believe, in 2 weeks, or the third time in 2 months, something like that, that they've had a massive terrorist attack. And it really makes you wonder whether or not the government in the UK can protect its own people. It's just amazing. I saw a story that there were 23,000 jihadists. I'm not sure if in London or in the country, but that's a lot of people who are part of a very serious army to hurt people. So the big story, big things happening in London. They have an election as well this week. We'll talk a little bit about the Paris Accords and the hysterical reaction to them. And I find it interesting that I think there's fair criticism here of President Obama, who went to this meeting, signed on behalf of the United States, never took this back to the U.S. Senate for ratification. He may have actually hurt the agreement by having done it that way. We'll talk to Bill and see what he thinks about that. Justice Ginsburg is in the middle of a controversy because of a few things that she said about President Trump. Is it going to be enough for her to recuse herself from the discussions of the so-called travel ban, or whatever ban they're calling it these days? I think so. I think she should step aside. I mean, especially after some of the things that she said. Former Director Comey will be going to Congress this week. I don't think he's going to have a lot to say, frankly, but we'll see. We'll wait a couple of days on that. The Democrats want to get away from Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders is now a millionaire, if you can believe that. Last year he made over $1 million. He sold a bunch of books. And Donald Trump is back to tweeting, and I wish he would stop, because he may have actually hurt himself today with some tweets about the travel ban, or the ban that may be going to the Supreme Court here very shortly. So let's say hello to our friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. Bill, it's lovely here in Dallas. We get a little rain this afternoon, but other than that, we cannot complain, Bill.
It's actually pretty decent in New York, and I of course, now that the Paris Agreement, though, has been so shattered by the American withdrawal, the forecast for tomorrow will have the water level going up to the 14th floor of Trump Tower. People feel their real estate values are going to be affected. Manhattan will disappear. I had planned to go in on Friday, but I can't anymore. And I think, this is the end of the world. I know it's the end of the world because I see it on CNN. I've read it in the New York Times. So it really must be the end of the world.
That's right. In fact, we're going to change the theme song to our show, Bill, to Skeeter Davis's "The End of the World," because we think that's the song that. But yeah, it is amazing, the reaction, and I want to get your thoughts on that, because I thought the reaction to President Trump pulling out of the agreement was just hysterical. I mean, it's just absolutely hysterical. By the way, if a polar bear shows up on your front yard, from the North Pole, we want you to interview that polar bear, take a few pictures, and let us know so that we can break the story before CNN that the polar bears are actually swimming in New York.
Oh, I expect that to happen. The polar bears will be swimming, and also there's a run on sunscreen. Every drugstores are all out of sunscreen, because the forecast for Saturday, as a result of our pulling out of the agreement, is the temperatures will rise to 110. And this is, they revised, as soon as we pulled out, they revised all their forecasts.
That's right.
So we really are expecting trouble.
Well, in fact, it reminds me of that Twilight Zone episode where the Earth was getting warmer and warmer. I don't know if you remember that episode, but it's pretty good one. Before we get to all the topics today, Bill, I just wanted to quickly go back in history for just a bit. It was tonight, June 5th, 1968, that Robert Kennedy was assassinated. President Reagan died on this day in 2004. And then, of course, D-Day was getting started probably about this time. The ships were probably leaving the UK, headed for Normandy and other places. So big important day, June 5th. Any thoughts of Robert Kennedy? Do you think he would have gotten the nomination, Bill, if he had lived?
Yes. Yes, I think that in the end, the Kennedy power would have given him the nomination over Eugene McCarthy and maybe some other people who decided to run. Of course, obviously, his assassination was a great tragedy. I think the symbolism of it, though, was marred at the time by the attempt to make him into a demigod. He was not a demigod. He was a very tough politician. But I remember when the funeral train came back. I think it went to. I think his remains were sent to New York. Yes, and then I think brought down to Washington for burial in Arlington, near his brother. I mean, they had honor guards and things like that. And I think, ironically, in a way, it diminished the occasion because the attempt to politicize, to make him into something he really was not, I think was kind of resented by a lot of people. He is buried in Arlington, right near his brother, but sufficiently far away so that the two are not confused. Whenever I go to Arlington and I visit that location, I'm always amazed at how they placed Robert Kennedy's grave. And you had the feeling that it was made very clear that he was not to be that close to his brother, who, of course, was President of the United States. And as a result, he has a kind of lone grave a little bit down the hill. Robert Kennedy was a very complex man. He was not a very popular man inside politics. He became Attorney General when his brother was elected president, even though he had never even practiced law. And that actually led to the adoption of what is known as the Kennedy Law, which bans nepotism when a president takes office, bans nepotism in terms of appointments to federal agencies. That law came up again earlier this year, you remember, when Jared Kushner was named to a White House position.
That's right.
But the interpretation of the law is that the law excluded the White House staff.
Yeah, of course, that's right, because Robert Kennedy was Attorney General, so he would have had to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. I just, what I remember of it was the night he was killed, about 10:30, I think it was. I went to bed, and I saw the report that he was leading or ahead in California. It was still not official. Of course, I'm talking Central Time, so they were still counting votes in the West. And I just remember the next morning waking up and going down, and I asked my father who won in California, and my father said, well, Kennedy was killed, and my little sister's sitting there in the kitchen table. Saying to both of us, well, but wasn't he killed a few years ago? Confusing the two Kennedys. Yeah, so it was just an amazing period to be alive, I guess, to go through it. And what is remarkable to me is, and as I say, I just want to touch briefly on this, but what is remarkable to me is how far away that all seems right now, Bill. I mean, it seems like it's like a different country, it seems like. A different country, different era, and yet many of the same stresses and strains. I remember I was working at the New York Times during that period, and I remember Scotty Reston, James Reston, once we had a conversation, and he was saying how poisonous the atmosphere was. And that's exactly what people say today, how poisonous the atmosphere is. So while it was a different era, different time, some of the same stresses, the overriding issue of race, which has now erupted again on our college campuses, the war in Vietnam, which people don't realize that the war in Vietnam was not actually that big an issue in the country as a whole. It was a big issue in left-wing politics, but it was not World War II, and people should not confuse the two. And of course, Kennedy was a direct rival, even though a Democrat, of the man in the White House, Lyndon Johnson, who his brother had picked to be Vice President of the United States. But Kennedy did not like Johnson. Kennedy was very much a man of emotion, and he treated Johnson very poorly. Johnson treated him much better than he treated Johnson. But what happened also, remember, was the emergence of Ted Kennedy. After Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, he became the torch holder of the Kennedy family. And of the Kennedys, he was probably
the most compassionate. He was a true liberal. The others, I think, were perhaps a mixture, which was appropriate for the time and for their position. But Ted Kennedy didn't really go very far. I mean, he stayed as a U.S. Senator for the rest of his life. He tried to be president in 1980, and it didn't work out. But I think it was the assassination of Robert Kennedy also that drove Jacqueline Kennedy to leave the country to marry Aristotle Onassis and to kind of disappear for a while, because she said at the time, they're killing Kennedys, and I think she feared for her children.
Well, with good reason, probably, because you're right. I mean, there was a lot of concern at the time. I just, just to repeat what I said, it just seems like such a long time ago. It was. I mean, it'd be 49 years. So when you think of 49 years, and let's say you go back, let's say 1968, you go back 49 years, that would have been 1927 or something like that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So
yes, it was. That's a half a century. Remember?
That's it. That's it.
Yes.
So you just think about the people who were born who don't have who just have a passing. The baseball stadium. Bill, I'll just say one quick thing here. The baseball stadium in Washington D.C. before the new one was built was actually called RFK Stadium.
Oh,
and,
it was. Yes.
Yes, and it was interesting because they would play baseball. The Senators were there; they would play baseball, and then the Redskins would play football there. And you'd be hearing it on the radio, whenever the Cowboys were playing the Redskins. Well, the game is at RFK Stadium, and one of my boys said to me, "What's that, RFK Stadium?" And I said, "Well, Robert F. Kennedy." And they go, "Oh, yeah, okay." So it's like different times. So I just thought it was interesting. Just wanted to get your thoughts on something that happened a long time ago.
Oh, sure. And I remember the night. I called my editor very early in the morning, and I said, "Did you know that Robert Kennedy had been assassinated?" Of course, he knew by then, because the Times had called him. But it was absolutely stunning, because it was the second Kennedy. President Kennedy had been assassinated only 4 years earlier. 5 years earlier. And it was also not very long after Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And Robert Kennedy gave a very, very famous, moving speech about Martin Luther King. And then, of course, not many weeks later, he too was assassinated. One of the interesting things is that in those days we had very few people had color television. It was just actually coming in. It had been in for a while, but most people still had black and white television. There was no such thing as cable television. Most cities had like 4 or 5 channels, and that was it. There were no computers in the home. The most advanced device most people had was an answering machine, and even that was not in most homes. So just the change in technology over the last 49 years has been so completely dramatic.
That's right. No, you're exactly right. And just remembering that Saturday morning of the Robert F. Kennedy funeral, watching it with my parents was just the difference in technology. You're right; it was pretty incredible. Well, let's talk a little bit about current events here. We had another terror attack in the UK, and this one on Saturday night. And to me, the most amazing thing, Bill, that I heard is that they have 23. They estimate they have 23,000 jihadists. In London or England? I mean, probably London, I would think.
No, in the whole country, actually.
In the whole country, okay.
Yes, and they say they can only follow 3,000.
Okay, but that really begs the question: can this government protect its people? And it makes me wonder, if I was living in the UK today, and I was going to a public place, would I like to have the opportunity to defend myself? I think I would. To have a gun with me, because when you go back to that event, would have been Saturday night for us or Saturday afternoon for us, whatever, late Saturday night for them in London. You think that anybody there with a gun could have at least disabled one of, I mean, we've talked about this before, but at least disable one of the killers, and at the very least, detain the operation. I mean, it seems like these people have, they're just sitting ducks. These poor people, they're just sitting ducks for these terrorists, Bill. And it makes me angry. If I was living there, I'd be pretty angry about it, Bill.
Yes. Now, in this case, ironically, the terrorists didn't use guns. They used knives and cars and a car. But it is absolutely true. I remember the famous Luby's shooting in Texas, where a crazed gunman, got up in a restaurant and killed 22 people. And there was a man in the restaurant who survived who said, "I had a pistol in the glove compartment of my car, and if I could have gotten to it, I could have saved most of those people." But I think the rule at that time was you couldn't bring a gun into a restaurant or something like that, so he had to leave it in his car. But yes, not only were the citizens of London, at the mercy of these terrorists, but many police were, because most policemen in London and in England generally do not carry guns. So they immediately called in a special squad, and they were there with remarkable speed. They really were. I mean, they brought this to a close quite quickly, but the fact is still, what was it, 7 people were killed and some 48 wounded. And this was, as you pointed out, it was actually the third incident in about 3 months. There was the Manchester attack, and then before that there was another attack near the Houses of Parliament, and it's expected that there will be more.
Well, you would think, Bill, that if I'm a citizen of London, I would want the policemen who are patrolling, the bridge or certain key places, I would want them to have weapons. I mean, I don't know how is it possible that they don't have weapons. I mean, obviously the special forces do, and you could see it on the television, but I'm talking about, as you say, the common policeman walking down the street. He doesn't have a gun, and that's crazy, Bill. Maybe 20 years ago it was okay, but today,
yes.
That makes me feel very unsafe if I'm a citizen of London, Bill.
That's true. Well, this is a tradition among the bobbies, which policemen are called in England, named for Robert Peel of the 19th century, and they have some pride in the fact that they don't carry guns, but it's a very dangerous proposition. It really is. It makes the police officer almost useless in the face of somebody who does have a gun. And yes, I agree with you. I think well-trained officers should be carrying guns, and maybe they'll rethink it. But you have that elite attitude on the part of some who make the laws in England and decide public opinion that, well, we are a much more civilized country if the police do not have guns. Well, tell that to the victim of a terrorist who had a gun.
That's right. That's exactly right. And even though they were not using, I agree with you, they were not using guns. They were actually driving a car, I believe, in one case, and then in another case they were just knifing people. But
That's exactly right.
even if you had a gun, you could shoot at the windshield, and
That's right.
at the very least, distract or stop the killers. I just think it really makes me wonder how much more of this the people of these countries are going to take, because there seems to be I was watching this lady from the UK. Maybe you've seen her on Fox News as well. She's an author, I believe, or a reporter, who is saying, who's going to protect us from these people. I wouldn't be surprised if there is a movement from the bottom up, Bill. I agree. It won't come from the political class, but from the bottom up, people saying, hey, I got to protect myself because you people simply can't. It's not a knock on the police officers or the troops. It's just a reality, Bill.
That's exactly right. And, many of these warm-hearted laws are established by elitists, and the people who become the victims are the ordinary people who aren't members of the elite. We've seen that in attitudes toward crime. We've seen it in many other areas. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I think some people felt that this attack was kind of a turning point. I'm not so sure it is. There have been so many turning points since 9/11, where we thought, well, this is the attack that's going to turn public opinion around and make people understand that we're at war. But the reality is that they're forgotten rather quickly. It's a sad fact, but they are. They're forgotten rather quickly. And once they're forgotten, it takes another attack to remind us of the dangers of terror. But thus far, there does not seem to be any truly effective weapon to stop terror attacks. If people want to attack you, they're going to attack you. They have broken up some plots, according to the statements made by the Prime Minister of England, Theresa May, and others may have been deterred by fear, but the fact is some are attempted and some get through.
Right. And that's the importance of intelligence infiltrating some of these places where they're hanging around. Like one of these guys who was involved in the attack on Saturday night was apparently in some documentary or something like that. I mean,
yes.
it just seems to me that I don't know. I just maybe I'm overreacting, but if I was a citizen of London or of England, I'd be pretty angry at my government right now. I mean, I would simply be saying, you people are not protecting me from these individuals, and I don't know what else to say, but they've got 23,000 of them. That's a lot of potential. I mean, that's 23,000 people who could be waking up every day saying, what can I get away with today, Bill? I mean, it's pretty frightening.
Yes, and remember, there is a temptation on the part of certain elements of the public, especially in England, not to resist. A temptation to say, let's give up. Let's give them exactly what they want. Let's get out of foreign countries. Let's turn against Israel, and we'll be safer. At least they think they will be safer. And who cares about all these other things? And that attitude is much stronger, I think, than we believe. Now, as you pointed out, there will be an election in Britain on Thursday. It is a national parliamentary election, and it will determine who the next prime minister will be. At the beginning of the campaign last month, their campaigns are much shorter than ours, the Conservatives were leading by like 20 points in the polls, and that lead has been cut to single digits, and there is always a possibility of an upset. And what is so tragic there is that the head of the Labour Party, who might become prime minister in the event of an upset, is a man who has great sympathy for the terrorists and has said so over the years. He's a real hard leftist. And it would be tragic if Great Britain basically surrendered and went in that direction. But it could happen.
It could happen in a few days. I think the election is on Thursday, so we'll see how it turns out. We're going to take a little break, Bill. When we come back, we'll talk more about France, the climate accords, and a lot of other stories. We'll be right back. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas, and we're chatting today with our friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. Bill, I thought we'd be talking tonight a great deal about the Paris Climate Accords, and obviously the Terrorist Act became a more important issue. But I am amazed at the reaction from the left, and because this is such a lousy deal. I mean, I don't know how anybody can think that this is going to be good for climate change. This is basically a deal. First of all, it was never ratified for the U.S. Senate, so that makes it a constitutional problem for us. But on top of that, when you look at this bill, it doesn't, or this agreement, it doesn't really force countries to do much of anything. There's no enforcement mechanism. China, I think, doesn't have to do anything until 2030. The United States has to do some things. In fact, we have to put up $3 billion as well. So it just seems to me like a lousy deal. And I'm convinced the only reason President Obama didn't take it to the Senate bill is because he thought Hillary Clinton would win and he would get away with another treaty by executive agreement or executive order bill.
I think that's true. I think also he didn't take it to the Senate because he could never get it by the Senate. I mean, the Senate would not accept this any more than the Senate would have accepted the Iran nuclear deal, which is another one of these executive agreements. It's an outrage to me, as somebody who believes in the Constitution, that on two very critical occasions the President of the United States went around the Constitution and not too many people said anything. And that's the outrage. Had this been Donald Trump doing that, I mean, they would have all been fainting in Washington and medical care would be needed. The world is coming to an end. The country is becoming a dictatorship. But Obama did it. He signed on to this thing. And as you said, there is absolutely nothing in it that would probably have resulted in anything to improve the climate. The whole idea of climate change, first of all, is now accepted as settled science by the Washington Press Corps. And we are told that we have to shut up. We cannot question it because if we question it, we are anti-science and that we are really not good for the earth. But I think a lot of people have a lot of questions about climate change and how serious it is, whether humans really contribute as much as some claim, and why so many predictions for particular years don't seem to pan out. And yet we're not permitted to have that discussion.
Right, and if you bring it up, as you say, you're a denier, you're whatever, and I thought there was one article by Matt Lewis. I forgot what magazine he writes for, but I thought he had a really good analysis of this agreement. He said that the supporters of the agreement, I'm paraphrasing, the supporters of the agreement say that if you support the agreement, therefore you understand climate change or you understand the environment. If you don't support the agreement, you're a denier and whatever. But he said there's another option, and that is that this is not an agreement that makes a lot of sense. And what's interesting to me is, and I was looking for the article today, but I couldn't find it. Maybe you've seen it. But the president of the Sierra Club, either the current president or a past president, came out and was criticizing this agreement, basically calling it a fraud, saying this is not what people say it is. This is not going to do anything about the climate because the number one polluter in the world doesn't have to do anything till 2030, Bill, and even then there's no enforcement mechanism. I mean, what are you going to force the Chinese to do something in 2030? What if they say we're not ready? There's no enforcement mechanism, which is another reason, Bill, it should have been a treaty, because if it's a treaty, then there are consequences to the other parties because we as a country are putting everything on the line, and there are consequences, Bill.
Yes, that's right. If it's a treaty, it has the force of American law, and it must be followed throughout the United States. If they wanted this, it should have been a treaty, but as we pointed out before, it probably never would have gotten past the Senate. A treaty requires a two-thirds vote. It's considered a very serious step to have a treaty with a country. And I have always believed that we're always starting in the wrong place on climate change. I am not a scientist. I'm not an expert on climate science, but it seems to me that there are an awful lot of questions that have gone unanswered. And if you dare to ask them, you're insulted immediately, as we just said. I would like to see a challenger-type commission. In other words, the type of commission that was impaneled to investigate the Challenger tragedy in the 1980s, the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. And this panel would be composed of eminent scientists who are not identified with any side in the climate change debate, and they would have to answer these questions. What do we know? What don't we know? And what must we know to make the kind of decisions that we need to make involving climate change? I haven't seen such a panel, and I would like to see it. Something that really presents to the American people unvarnished facts. And let's really get to the bottom of all the doubts that are raised about climate change.
Well, I would love that. I would love that. And President Trump might very well do that right now and say, hey, look, let's settle this once and for all. I mean, let's have a debate. But I happen to be, I've seen in my lifetime, I think I mentioned to you this one time before, that I've seen over the last 30 years the cover photo of Newsweek, one time telling us we were all going to freeze to death, and then the other one telling that we were all going to burn to death. So if science can be that wrong in 20 years, what makes us, or that not that wrong, but I mean, if they can have that difference of opinion in 20 years, what makes me think that we have a clue of what's going to happen 20 years from now? And also, Bill, if this is as important to President Obama as it appears to be, why didn't he give a speech to the nation saying, look, I'm submitting this to the U.S. Senate for ratification because this is vital for our national interest and so on? He didn't do that. He never gave a speech on climate change. He never went to the nation and spoke about climate change. He could never get through even Democrat majorities anything about climate change. That's why it makes me wonder just how real the science is, Bill.
I think you raise very good points, and people should note that this is not a theoretical discussion. We're not talking about the theory of climate change here. We're talking about a set of proposals, a set of propositions that would require the expenditure of trillions, not billions, but trillions of dollars to treat a problem that we really, in my view, don't completely understand. And what if it turns out to be wrong? What if it turns out that all that money just goes down the drain? I think the bitterness, especially of poor people in the world, will be very, very severe. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do something. It doesn't mean we shouldn't follow it. We should follow it. We should study it more, not less, and not use phrases like settled science. There's no such thing as settled science. But go after the information first, make sure we are right, and make sure that the money is being spent on things that actually make a difference. Because another fear that people have with this agreement, well, we're no longer in it, was that money would be transferred to the third world and it would disappear, like a lot of other money that's been transferred to the third world, and we would be left, holding the bag and yet not getting anything for it.
Right, and there's another thing too, Bill, that bothers me a great deal. They keep bringing up the theory, and that's all that it is. There's no concrete evidence of this, but they bring it up anyway. They bring up the theory that climate change is devastating, for example, Africa and the third world and agriculture in many of those countries. But I would argue that I think what's devastating agriculture in Africa is the kind of agrarian reform and socialist policies that have basically destroyed the countryside, as happened in many Latin American countries, where you basically have the government take over the farmers, and instead of the farmers being in business to produce, they're in business to take care of the government. And I think that, to me at least, and I can look at examples in Mexico and other countries where I believe that has, in Cuba, where it's government policy, not climate change, that has created these problems, Bill.
I think that's absolutely true. There was a discussion today, led by the president, on the air control system in the United States. And what he revealed is something many of us knew who have to follow the news professionally, but that we are way behind in the adoption of a modern air control system. In America, it has gone on for years and years and years. The development has gone on for years and years and years. It is nowhere near ready, and the president wants to change the entire administration of this very important program. It controls the airflow over the air traffic over the United States. Government can do things well. I mean, we've seen that the government can do things well, but often government does things very badly, and there's no real accountability. So when we fly in an airliner, we are under the control of equipment that was designed 20, 30, 40 years ago. And we can do better as a nation.
Oh, I think so. I agree with you. And I think that we've done well, for example, here in the United States when it comes to air pollution, when it comes to the environment. We've actually done, I think, anybody, I certainly don't remember this, but I've heard from people who, let's say, remember L.A. in 1970, and they say it's like night and day comparing the air today with that of, let's say, L.A. in 1970 or any other major U.S. city, that we've made tremendous improvements. So, the idea that other countries are lecturing the United States is something that bugs the heck out of me, because I think we've done a pretty good job of actually cleaning up our environment, Bill.
I think we have, and remember, a lot of that was done with the participation of the free enterprise system, because one of the most important elements in cleaning up our air was the catalytic converter that cleaned emissions in cars. And they're much cleaner today than they were before the catalytic converter was invented. And I think it demonstrates what happens when industry will work with government toward a common objective. It can work well. Sometimes it doesn't, but it can work well. We've also, in that kind of partnership, sometimes a hostile partnership, but a partnership, made cars much safer today than they were at one time. The auto industry is not my favorite industry. I think they really did mess up rather badly over the years, and there's a very good reason why foreign cars today outsell American cars in the United States. But the technology that we've been given in the last 30, 40 years is dramatically better than what we had. And the air is cleaner, the cars are safer. I have to give the environmental movement its credit in this respect. The trouble is, will they go too far and start getting into areas that are uncertain, where we begin to spend enormous amounts of money for nothing?
Right. And I'll just say one more thing, Bill, and then we'll move on to other topics. But I think what also makes it difficult for all of these environmental agreements and so on, that it seems to me they're very easy to talk about in the abstract when you have a bunch of white-collar bureaucrats sitting around a nice meeting and talking about climate change. But when you then take it to the country and then all of a sudden climate change means I may lose my job or my utility bills are going to go up and the price of gasoline is going to go up, all of a sudden this climate change debate is a lot different than it was, as I say, between these white-collar bureaucrats who were driven to their meeting by chauffeurs and so on. I just think this is where the clash always comes, and that's why I don't think President Obama sent it to the Senate, because he understood that once it got to the Senate and they would open up this agreement, they would tear it up in a couple of days, Bill.
I think that's absolutely correct. Yes, you get people advocating for climate change, and yet you wonder after a while what it's really about. Is it about climate change? Is it improving the climate for the planet? Or is it simply a wealth transfer scheme to transfer huge amounts of money from one country to another? And I'm afraid there's a lot of that in the climate change issue. That's why I say we need an independent commission of people of impeccable integrity to look into the whole subject and to determine where we actually are.
I agree. I'm with you 100% on that. Let's have that commission, have 5 or 6, 7 of the finest people in the country that both sides can agree on, and let's have a debate. And I'm willing to listen to what they say, but in the meantime, let's not come up with all these agreements, especially like this, that have absolutely no binding or enforcement mechanisms that, frankly, don't make much sense. I want to get into a few other topics, Bill, that you wrote about at Urgent Agenda. Justice Ginsburg, who made some pretty amazing remarks about, I think he was a candidate then, I'm not sure if he was president already, but Donald Trump. And now there's good reason. I certainly think she should step aside. I don't see how anybody can believe whatever this lady writes about Donald Trump, Bill.
I think it's absolutely correct. She should not have gotten involved in politics, and she did, I think, apologize for it, or at least stop making comments like that, because she was so widely criticized. Justices are not supposed to involve themselves in the political area, although there have been times in history where they have informally advised the president. I think it occurred in the 1960s. But it's not proper, especially when a lower court decision is going to be presented to the Supreme Court that ruled against President Trump and made references in the decision to President Trump's campaign speeches. Here is a Supreme Court justice who commented directly on those speeches, on who Donald Trump is or who she thought he is, and clearly she should recuse herself. I don't think there's any requirement that she do it, and I don't think she will. I just don't think that's the way Ruth Ginsburg thinks.
Well, unless it comes down to a 5-4 decision that President Trump loses, and then a lot of people are going to be bringing this up, because I think if I was Justice Roberts, I would say to her, step aside for the good of the court. But who knows? I guess she doesn't really have to, like you say. Now, Director Comey, Bill, is going to be appearing before Congress. I don't know what he's going to say. I mean, I think this thing is going to be the biggest bummer since I don't know what. But there's nothing there that he can say anymore that I think will change anything, Bill.
Well, that's interesting, because I heard several other commentators echo that thought earlier tonight, including Charles Krauthammer. It'll be a big television event. It's going to be like the Army McCarthy hearings. Everybody will be watching. I don't think he's going to say anything either, and I think there's a good reason for it. If he simply says, look, the president said things to me that I guess I could have interpreted badly. I don't really think he was putting any pressure on me. But I will leave that judgment up to others. That's probably what he'll pretty much say. If he tries to get away with, when you take it all in totality, he was obstructing justice, every person who has any decency and integrity is going to say back to him, why didn't you say anything about that at the time? Now that you're a fired office holder, your word doesn't have that much weight. Who takes the word of a disgruntled office holder? It's something you dismiss almost immediately. So he's in a situation where he will have to demonstrate if he really wants to bring Trump down, and I wouldn't blame him if he did, but he would have to demonstrate that not only did Trump do improper things, but he realized at the time they were improper and that he notified the proper government agencies, and he didn't do it. There's no evidence that he showed any great concern while these conversations that will be the subject of the hearing were taking place. So I think you're right. I think it's going to be kind of a letdown, and he will drop a couple of hints here and there, but he will say, in effect, I leave it up to others to make a decision.
Right, and I don't know if it's going to be the Senate or the House. I'm not sure which of the two he's going to, or maybe it's a joint committee. I don't know. But I do expect some of the Republicans to ask him about unmasking of U.S. citizens, Bill. I do believe,
I hope that is, yeah.
And because that I think is the big issue that no one's talking about, but that's the one that I think is going to be huge. And we'll be talking about it in a future program. It hasn't hit the fan yet, but I think that's coming, Bill.
I think that's coming, too. Now, it was pointed out in several news stories today that the news media does not in any way seem interested in that story because it involves the Obama administration and its possible abuse of its surveillance powers to get private information on American citizens. Now, of course, if this had been the Trump administration under investigation, or the country would be going hysterical by now, and people would be instructed to look under their beds at night for microphones.
That's right.
You know, but it's the Obama administration, so nobody's interested, and that's how
or Bush or Cheney,
journalism.
Bill. Bush or Cheney. Can you imagine? Oh my God! This would be imagine
Cheney?
if this was Bush or Cheney. Yes.
Cheney was portrayed. Cheney, who was an excellent public servant, was portrayed as a monster. The monster Cheney, Darth Vader, Hillary Clinton called him, and yes, if you know, if this had been Trump charged with some of these things, I mean, there would be mass hysteria and substantial need for hospital beds. But it is Obama who is under discussion, so therefore, well, maybe he made a few minor mistakes.
Right.
As with the Iran nuclear deal, as with the Paris Agreement. I mean, he's not perfect, you know. Oh, geez. The hypocrisy is just flowing. It really is.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But again, it's going to get, it has legs, as they say, because there is a, I think the Internet carries a lot of weight with people these days, and there's a lot of Internet sources that will carry the story, even if the mainstream media doesn't. I think a lot of others will carry it. Bill, you had a quick note today. I think it was later today, Monday. You wrote about Hillary Clinton. It kind of reminds me of that song "Go Away, Little Girl." You know, I think Steve Lawrence wrote that song about the Democrats are basically trying to tell, "Go away." I mean, we don't really want you around anymore, Bill.
I think that they have secretly promised her extra frequent flyer miles if she goes away, and they will all chip in and buy her a vacation of about 4 years to some island. They want her out of it because she's making a fool of herself. You know, how many times can you go over the last election? She's blaming the Russians. She's blaming the Democratic National Committee. She's blaming this person. She's blaming that person. And then at the end she says, of course I take responsibility for all my decisions. But she's trying to make the case that these things were out of her control, and that's why she lost. Look, nobody wants to hear the explanations of someone who has lost. It may be a very sad state of affairs. One can certainly feel for her, having put in so much effort and having it come to naught, especially since she lost to a man who is considered one of the worst candidates in history. But she lost, and she should simply do what people do after these elections, and that's to go away for a while. If she wants to come back in 2020 and compete again, she's obviously free to do so. But she's even being attacked by personal assistants of hers in the past who said, enough already, enough already.
Right. Well, I thought it was hilarious.
She had
Bill,
I thought it was a combination. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I thought it was hilarious when she was blaming the database, that she inherited a really bad database. I always thought they had the best database in the world, Bill.
They certainly bragged about it, didn't they?
They sure bragged about
it.
Yeah.
Yes, she is a combination of Richard Nixon and Joseph Stalin. You know, with and if Richard Nixon and Joseph Stalin had their own afternoon soap opera, it would be the Hillary Clinton story.
But you know, to Richard Nixon's credit, after he left in disgrace, he basically went away. He didn't see him again, of course, politically. But he did write a bunch of very good books that I remember reading in the late 70s and in the 1980s, and books that I think contributed to the political debate about the Cold War, particularly Russia. And maybe she ought to do that. You know, she ought to take all that experience that she has and turn it into she should become a stateswoman, write about things and get out of politics. I mean, maybe this is an opportunity that few people get, Bill.
I think she well, you know what would happen is if she wrote the book and it didn't sell well, she would probably say, that's because men won't buy it.
That's right.
You know, that's what I have calculations from the bookstores. Men are trashing copies. They're going over, writing dirty notes in my book.
Right.
That's what would happen. Of course, that's what she should do. She should also have angled to take the presidency of some college, and I'm sure one would be offered to her, and probably a very good college. And show a little dignity, but that's not her. 2020 she will be, let me see, I think 73. Still not, still young enough to run, I mean, in today's world. And I think now we see that Joe Biden is also considering running.
That's right.
This is, they'll have to tell Joe there's an election, but he will run, and he might even find the polling place. But the Democratic Party has absolutely no young leadership. Have you noticed?
None whatsoever. I mean, they're a party of a different generation, and that's a real problem. I mean, that's a real problem for them. No question about it. Bill, let me take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about another Democrat, Bernie Sanders. We'll be right back. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas. One more segment here with our friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. No, Bill, I wanted to have a little bit of fun before we get into next week. I wanted to have a little bit of fun with Senator Sanders because it turns out that he made $1 million in 2016.
Yes.
And Bernie's a millionaire. He made $1 million writing books and giving speeches. How do you like that, Bill?
Well, he's obviously a champion of the common man. He also has three houses. Bernie is about as big a hypocrite as you'll find. We also now see, by the way, I think this is interesting, that he is campaigning for the Labour Party in England, whose head is a complete kook. I mean, he's a crackpot and a man who has shown sympathy for terrorists and for crazy movements. And Bernie is supporting him, or at least endorsing him. Bernie, I think, needs to go away. Also, he needs to go away with Hillary on that long vacation, because he is. There's, who was it who said? No, I don't know if it was said about. Was it said about Bernie Sanders that he honeymooned in the? Well, I think it was Lindsey Graham who said about Bernie Sanders that he honeymooned in the Soviet Union and never came back.
That's it. That was Senator Graham. But it turns out that he did go to the USSR for his honeymoon, but he said that he did it. It was a visit, an official visit, as the mayor of Burlington, Vermont. Now, I don't know too many guys or too many women who would like to go on their honeymoon while their husband is on a business trip. I couldn't figure that out, Bill.
Well, that. Yes, but that's when you're a member of the intellectual classes, you think differently, and I'm sure that Mrs. Sanders loved the idea of bringing a little bit of Burlington to the Kremlin.
That's right.
And I'm sure they appreciate.
They sure did. Well, one of the things I thought it was interesting, Bill, because writing books and becoming a millionaire, criticizing your government, which is what he did. Is not something you can do in Cuba or Venezuela, and certainly not in the old USSR. So somebody's got to tell Bernie that he was a pretty lucky guy that he can become a millionaire criticizing governments, because they don't do that in socialist countries, Bill.
Yes, that's right. That's right. No, Bernie is, he's becoming a caricature of himself, and I think I don't remember how old he is. How old is Bernie? About 74 or something. But I mean,
well,
I don't know if he'll run.
He's in his 70s. I mean, exactly what side of this or what, whether it's closer to 70 or 80, I don't know. But he's in his 70s. But Bill, maybe
he would have to be. He would have to be in his mid-70s because he and I were at the University of Chicago at the same time.
Okay, all right.
And,
well, maybe
I did not
learn.
know him.
Well, you would have told him not to go to the USSR for his honeymoon. I know you. You would have said, Bernie, don't do that.
That's right. I would have told him to go to Alabama.
That's right. Go to Alabama or just stay in Vermont, if nothing else. I'm sure they got some pretty places up there for a honeymoon, don't you think? I think they do up there in Vermont.
It's a very pretty state. It's a green state.
That's right.
It's a very nice state. I was up there last summer, and his wife has her own set of problems also because she was head of a college, Jane Sanders was, and apparently there were some charges pending or lawsuits pending about the way she handled money. So she may have her own crisis.
I think the next thing we're going to learn, Bill, is that Bernie Sanders has an offshore account. I'm sure we'll learn.
In the Cayman Islands, right.
In the Cayman Islands,
He's doing it to show respect for our Caribbean brothers and sisters.
That's right, to show respect for the third world, because he doesn't want the third world to think that we just want to keep all the money. So he took a little bit over to the Cayman Islands just to be politically correct. Bill, looking at next week, a lot of stuff going on. Of course, there's an ongoing situation. Seems like every day is crazy now. But I like to see President Trump stop tweeting. How is that for a wish? I think he hurt himself a great deal today tweeting.
He did. He has got to stop. He has got to stop, or so there can be real consequences. There are some legal authorities who feel he's destroyed a Supreme Court case by some things he said today in his tweets. He looks foolish. I can understand he's a very combative man, and I can understand. And his comments about the mayor of London were completely correct, but you don't have to say everything that you feel. And, if it gets worse, there is the possibility, I don't think he'll be impeached. I mean, unless they find something really serious. And up to now, they have not really found anything serious. But he could be pressured into resigning, or he could be removed. That's something we haven't thought about, that these things give an impression of a man who's not completely stable, which I don't think is true, but it gives the impression. But apparently, I would have to read the amendment. There is a mechanism by which a man who is thought to be incapable of carrying out the office can be removed, and I think it's under the 25th Amendment. And that could happen. I know it sounds very far-fetched, but so did Nixon's resignation sound far-fetched. It could happen, and he's got to stop this. He's got to stop giving the impression that he is run by his emotions, because it's scaring people.
That's right. Well, it's scaring me. I thought he really hurt himself today with those tweets. And the best thing, he tweeted several things about the incident in London. One of them was great, where he says, "We stand with the UK." I thought that was great.
Yes, he did some good things too. Yeah.
Yeah. But then the other one about the mayor, I thought, why get involved in that? I mean, they've got their own problems over there. Why get involved in something like that? But he may just resign too. I mean, just come to the point where he thinks that this is maybe not the job that he thought it was, or whatever. But I don't. Again, my own personal prediction, for whatever it's worth, I don't think he's running for re-election. I just don't. And I'll just go on record as that. I just don't think he is. I don't know. I just have a funny feeling. But I've been wrong about him and every other thing, so maybe I'll be wrong about this one too, Bill.
Well, he doesn't have to decide. He's only in his fifth month of the presidency, so he won't have to decide until late 2019 or early 2020. He's the head of his party, and if he runs, look, it really will depend on where he stands in the polls. If he stands at 10%, he may, I think he'll be out of there. But if he's at 40-45%, it's the old story that you can't beat somebody with nobody. and if he sees no important challenger, he might run again. But that's really speculation at this point. We have so much time, and remember, biology plays its role. So,
that's right.
We don't know what condition he'll be in. But
that's
I think that it's interesting that Pence has made some interesting political moves recently, starting up his own PAC and doing other things, and I think he's ready.
Well, I think so. But then again, I think you're exactly right. And let me make it clear to all of my friends listening that I want Trump to succeed, which is why I get frustrated with him once in a while. It's not that I don't like him. I want him to succeed. But, I see him hurting his cause with some of the things that he's doing. I mean, I basically agree with what he's doing politically, but some of his ways are troubling, to say the least. Bill. Well, have a great week, Bill, and I look forward to our next time.
Oh, next time on Sunday or Monday, we will be discussing.
Well, I think I'm not sure yet whether it's going to be Sunday or Monday, but it'll be one of those two.
Okay. Well, we're going to be talking about the results of the British election.
Yes, that's exactly right.
That will be a very important result.
Very important, and hopefully there's nothing else that happens in the UK. They've had enough problems already.
They certainly have, and we'll keep our fingers crossed. Well, we'll talk to you next week then.
Thank you so much, Bill. Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. And that's going to do it for today, folks. Have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you later. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas.